It's interesting, and this is something we've talked a lot about. Standing here in front of Jimmy Lee Jackson's grave is probably a good place to talk about it. The contrast and comparison between Jimmy Lee's death and Reeb's death.
A white man's death gets more attention. Is racism partly behind that? Yes, I have no quarrel with that. That's not the whole story. There's an importance to Jimmy Lee Jackson's death, which I maybe didn't realize as much till much later. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death catalyzed the black community in this part of the state. Okay, it was a big deal here. Okay, it didn't get it international or whatever, but the catalytic effect on the black community here was very important to Bevel's ability. I mean, it created a force that he was able to mobilize and direct into the march.
Fager's talking about James Bevel, the charismatic field organizer of the SCLC who was directing the operations in Selma. Bevel's response to Jackson's death was that some large demonstration needed to happen.
He found a Bible verse somewhere in the Old Testament where somebody says, "I must go see the king." And that became his refrain. The king was George Wallace, and we got to go see the king and tell him this has to stop. They had enough after Jimmy Lee Jackson, and they wanted to do something.
Well, after Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed, Jim Bevel and I decided to go and pay a visit to the family.
That's Bernard Lafayette, a veteran civil rights organizer who helped lay the groundwork for the voting rights campaign here.
And when we arrived, his home was like one of those shotgun houses, and it was on stilts, bricks and stuff like that, and there was open sewage running in the backyard. And the whole family had been brutalized. There was his grandfather with the knot on his head, and there was his mother all bandaged up, and sister with her arm broken. There were broken spirits and also broken bones.
For months, there had been demonstrations in Marion and in Selma, but this event, the unbridled violence, the police brutality, the shooting of Jimmy Lee Jackson, it was categorically different.
We were sitting in the kitchen, and Bevel asked the grandfather whether he thought the marches should continue. And he very quickly, said, yes, definitely, they should continue. He said, I've lost everything. I have nothing more to lose now.
Sitting at the kitchen table with Jimmy Lee Jackson's grandfather, hearing his accounting of what could be gained and what could be lost, it all sounded familiar to Bernard Lafayette.
A couple of years before this, Bernard Lafayette was just starting out with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. SNCC was sending staff into rural communities to begin voter registration drives. And Lafayette wanted to be the director of one of those projects.
I was 22 years old, so, 22, you got to be in charge of something.
So he went to SNCC headquarters in Atlanta.
And there was a map of the South, and there was Alabama, but it had an X through it. I said, well, what about Alabama? He said, well, we're not going there, because we already sent 2 teams of SNCC workers there, and they came back with the same report. Nothing could be done there in Dallas County. They had the same reason. They said it was white folks were too mean and black people too scared.
But Lafayette went anyway. Soon he was in Selma surveying the challenge.
As long as you have people who are afraid, they also believe that nothing could be done, and they want things to stay the same. So my first task had to deal with helping scared black folks, have some courage.
When Lafayette arrived in Selma in early 1963, the civil rights movement was reaching its apex. The Montgomery bus boycott and then the sit-ins and the freedom rides had unleashed a wave of activism against segregation and against voting restrictions, and it would only build from there. Finally, white Americans seemed to be paying attention. But these other demonstrations had happened in larger cities. Selma was an entirely different story.
Black families had worked for the same white family for generations. And some of the women there were wet nurses. They nursed some of the white children. So there was a closeness that you couldn't imagine. First of all, I didn't believe change was possible. And then they didn't want to disturb their relationship because they felt very protective. They used to tell me that if God wanted us to be equal with whites, he would have made us white. You had to have a great imagination that any change was going to happen in Selma, Alabama.
There was an area next to Selma University where the young folks would gather. It's called the Block, and we sort of would hang down there.
Charles Malden was a 15-year-old high school student in 1963.
And Bernard Lafayette started showing up down there and talking to guys like myself. Began to ask us simple questions like, well, why can't your parents vote? Or why can't you drink out of the white water fountain? Or just simple questions that we had no answers to. We had been terrorized into staying inside of the box. And he began to ask questions that we had never dared ask ourselves because it was just too threatening. That would have been a danger to white society.
In talking to high schoolers like Charles Malden, Lafayette was assembling an army for an as-yet unannounced battle. What they were gearing up for wasn't just a campaign of incremental skirmishes to achieve legislative victories. This was a broader battle to change the very consciousness of Americans.
Once our consciousness was opened by people like Stokely and Bernard Lafayette, John Lewis, our minds grew by leaps and bounds. And unless you sort of boot it out of normalcy, then it's normal to not strive to increase your consciousness, you know. And Dr. King talked about that in Montgomery, about ending certain type of normalcies, you know, the normalcy of white supremacy, the normalcy of like poverty, the normalcy of the lack of distribution of wealth. That's normal. It takes electricity to somehow shock you out of that, and we had no way of understanding whether we'd succeed or not because it was all so new and so much bigger than probably anything that happened since the Civil War.
Selma had been the X on the map in the SNCC office in Atlanta for a reason. It had a reputation for being too volatile a place to organize. But Lafayette figured out a way to harness that volatility so that Selma was now generating the right kind of electricity, the kind of electricity that would bring hundreds of black people to the courthouse to register to vote each month, the kind of electricity that would fill the jails with peaceful protesters, the kind of electricity that would attract the attention of the Department of Justice.
The Department of Justice actually sued the city in a first-of-its-kind lawsuit over unconstitutional voter suppression in 1964. You may remember this from an earlier episode. Among the named plaintiffs were Sheriff Jim Clark and the local prosecutor Blanchard McLeod, who would fail to gain a conviction against the men accused of killing Jim Reeb. And after Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot in Marion, it was up to Blanchard McLeod to determine what to do. A shooting demands an inquiry. A state trooper shot an unarmed civil rights demonstrator in the stomach. McLeod told the press he had a signed confession of the shooter, but that the man had claimed self-defense. McLeod refused to identify him and refused to even acknowledge that he was a state trooper. It's unclear what evidence was presented to the grand jury, but no indictment was handed down. These things, though, are clear. That the man who shot Jimmy Lee Jackson was not brought to justice in 1965. That Jackson's death made his grandfather say to Bernard Lafayette and to James Bevel, "Yes, keep marching. I don't have anything left to lose." And that the march which then happened resulted in another brutal attack, this one in broad daylight at the foot of a bridge with television cameras rolling. And that footage, broadcast around the world, begat a call from Dr. King, which begat a swarm of ministers to Selma, among whom was a Unitarian from Boston named Jim Reeb.